All right, we are live here. We're talking about project-based learning, grading management, and standards and how that all works together. So I'm going to let Marquette kind of start us off with her question or what she wants to know or what she wants to hear for today.
Sure.
So go for it, Marquette.
Sure, thanks. I was really curious about the way people are marrying project-based or problem-based learning and standard-based grading. I'm not sure if anyone has actually attempted to kind of quantify the learning in a standard-based grading sense yet. So if you have, I'm interested in hearing how it went, and if not, I'm interested in perhaps discussing how we might get there. I think probably the first thing we ought to do, though, is start with introductions. So I guess I will start there. There's always this awkwardness when you meet online, right? So my name is Marquette Pierce. I'm from Rochester, New York, and I've been an English teacher for a decade, and I'm just transitioning to a position as a professional development specialist in the Monroe County area. So I'll be basically teaching teachers at this point. So Kevin, could you introduce yourself, and then we'll just kind of go along?
Sure. I'm Kevin Ashworth. I'm a sixth grade teacher in California, and I've been teaching for almost 20 years. And I am just kind of new to Twitter. I've only been on it for about a year, so I'm pretty excited about all these opportunities. So I'm just here to learn and moderate, and if you need help, just throw out a question or put it in the chat. Scott?
I'm Scott Marsden, and I'm a 16-year English social studies teacher in Northern California, and I'm also new to Twitter and to Google Hangouts, and so this is pretty cool to be able to do this and have this kind of conference with all of you guys.
All right, Robin.
I'm Robin, and I've been teaching for 25 years. I teach this year grade 4 or 5. I taught grade 2, 3 for about 24 years. And I teach in Surrey, British Columbia, Canada. I've been on Twitter for a couple of years. I'm very active in social media, and I love using, I've started using project-based learning in my classroom for my students. So I just wanted to come and see what other people were doing.
Awesome. Peter?
My name is Peter Gao. I've been teaching for roughly 40 years, and I'm actually not doing so much in the classroom these days as consulting and writing, but I'm also just interested in project-based learning and how teachers manage collaborative groups in particular, and the challenges of evaluating work that's been done by a group and putting groups together. All those things are fascinating to me. I also come from a place where we've made a pretty clear distinction between project-based and problem-based learning, which is sort of an interesting thing, and I'm not sure anybody else makes this distinction, so I have been working in an unusual school, I think, from that perspective.
I'm really interested in hearing more about that once we get through the introductions. See, who else haven't we heard from yet?
Liz, go for it.
Hi, I'm Liz Davis. This is Abby Davis. She's visiting with us also. I live outside of Boston in Watertown, Mass. I'm a English teacher, video teacher, and tech director. But I am moving to the Bay Area in the summer, looking for independent school job out there in the classroom, middle school teaching, if anybody knows of anything. And I'm very interested in project-based learning and design thinking as well. And right now I'm in a very traditional school, so ways to fit that into a very traditional model of teaching is also something I struggle with.
All right. Amanda.
Abby is in 4th grade.
Hi. It's afternoon here in Minnesota. I'm a teacher in high school science in Minnesota. For the first time this year, I started to do project-based learning in my biology classes. And so I'm just looking for guidance and ideas and I guess the experts on the subject, but even if you're not an expert, ideas is great. Oh, and I can only stay for like a couple minutes because I have Lego League kids coming over in about 10 minutes. Since we're a little behind on this session, I'll have to cut out early.
All right. You can always go to the YouTube link later on after
Yes.
the session. All right. So I guess who is doing project-based learning here?
I've been doing, I didn't realize it was called that, I guess, in an English classroom when you have students like create a wiki together or share their work in this collaborative fashion. So, so I guess I've been doing project-based learning and didn't realize it was called that.
I've been doing project-based learning for about 4 years, and my school is a project-based learning high school in Northern California. So that's the instructional model that my school has adopted. So all the teachers are supposed to teach pretty much wall-to-wall projects.
Scott, which school
Wow.
is that you work at?
It's called American Canyon High School, and it's a member of the New Tech Network.
That's
So
what I was wondering. That's great.
the New Tech Network, if you're not familiar with that, is about 130 schools now that are devoted to technology and project-based learning.
I'm doing a lot of project-based learning in my video class. It works beautifully there, kind of introduce something, give them some basic skills, and then they go off on their own. The projects really build on each other. I've got it. It works really well. In my English class, I have not put it in there. But in video, where I have that kind of freedom, I find that I love it. It's actually rather boring as a teacher because half the time I just sit there and I say, "Does anybody need any help? Anything I can do?" So that's sort of, that's kind of the downside of project-based learning as a teacher. It's really student-centered, I think, when it's working well, and then you kind of feel like, okay, glad everything's going well.
You know, I think that's interesting you say that about when it's going well. It's nice for the teacher to sit back, but I was surprised in delving into it this year for the first time how many skills my students lacked that they needed for project-based learning, that I ended up having to teach all these skills that I never realized they didn't have. And research is the big one that's coming to mind right now. Is they don't know how to find the resources they need, how to research effectively, and I spent a ton of time teaching my high school students just how to do that, because first of all they had a hard time coming up with questions, but then once they had a question, something they were interested in, then how to find resources for that. They just had never had the opportunity to do that, so they didn't know how.
I think that's a really important point that you make, that we have to teach kids how to actually engage in project-based learning because they haven't been given that opportunity in the past. And so kind of research skills and independence is something else I've noticed. When you first get started with it, my students have been desperate for me to tell them like what is the right answer. And when I say to them, like, I genuinely don't know, sweetheart, we got to find this together, they have not been told that. And I think that's a really valuable experience for them as well. I'm really interested as well, Peter, if you could talk a little bit about the difference, the way that you perceive it, between project and problem-based learning, and then maybe we could see whether we're actually doing problem or project-based learning in our own schools.
Sure. Problem-based learning, the way we have done it, is really sort of almost a case study model that we learned from a parent actually who was interested in having this checked out at the high school level from a parent who teaches in a medical school. And essentially, a problem is set up as a case, and the case kind of unveils itself piece by piece. So you start with a particular situation and then add different elements to the situation, and at each point you're asking the students to do some research, to do some prediction, to do some critical thinking about what's going on. Sometimes it's really the fundamental skill that I think we found that kids really needed to have most was the skill of looking at a situation and seeing what's there, and not just kind of jumping into assumptions or jumping toward that one right answer or that one easy answer. And I can't really think of a great example now. Well, yes, I can. For example, when I was teaching U.S. history, I had a really interesting little case that we used to do, which it started out, the first element was a graph, and the graph showed the Native American population of the island of Nantucket for a period of time. And if you look at the graph, it looks as though some really terrible, genocidal things happened, but in fact, that it was far more complicated than that. And so we would sort of roll out the case piece by piece. Here's the graph. What do you think? What do you see here? What do you think's going on? How could you find out more? What sort of research do you need to do? What facts do you need to gather? And then kind of move on from there. And you could do this as a full class. You could do elements of this as collaborative work among students. You could do elements of this as individual work. It was an interesting, it is an interesting technique. It's almost like imagining house. That might be the closest analog, because it's in fact from the same same domain as the TV show House.
I think that's really helpful. So it's kind of a case study, and you kind of walk the kids through. It sounds like it's inquiry based as well.
Oh, very much so. And I've got, I can, if you want to contact me on Twitter, I can probably send you some examples of cases as they unfolded, because we were able to use this in science, in English, in social studies kinds of courses. Actually, you can teach the novel through this methodology, which is kind of interesting. Sort of seeing each chapter as an unfolding element. But projects, we've also done big projects, and my big discovery as a teacher was when I had a student whose mother was a project manager for the Harvard University Press. And her kid came home with a big project I'd assigned with other students involved, and the mother saw this and exploded, and after she was done exploding at me, said, "Would you like me to come in and talk to your department about how we do this?" And we thought, yeah, we'd like to have you come in and talk to our whole faculty. So she really worked out some interesting ways of sort of adapting Gantt chart models. I think the challenge for teachers with project-based learning often is how we can break the steps down for students to do it themselves, and then how we can then help students learn to do that independently as they progress through a project-based curriculum. So, and I will shut up now. But it was interesting. It was an interesting challenge, and the feedback from students that she was able to get as a parent who was also a skilled, HR person and ask good questions was really helpful to us in helping us understand how we could design projects that worked for kids and where kids found the real challenges. Now I'll shut up.
I think the questions for me was the surprising part. Amanda was saying earlier that her kids had trouble coming up with questions, and I found that to be true. Is when I posed the question, they could go and work on it or the problem. But when it was kind of like, well, what do you want to do? It was, they had a hard time really getting something that was deep and worth doing. Something that couldn't just be Googled in 30 seconds is not what we're looking for in a quality project or problem. So that's been I think the hardest thing is, and my most active time is spent in that kind of, when they're searching on their own, helping frame their essential question as something that's worthwhile and researchable and actually actionable, rather than just Googling it and finding all the answers on Google.
The design, the design thinking model of first not defining the question immediately, but kind of generally having a topic and doing a bunch of empathic kind of research, and then defining the problem after that. The whole idea of the problem finders, if you've seen Ewan McIntosh's work, I think has been really interesting. I've been working with that with some students. I'll give them a general question, but then they need to do the empathy work, and then they redefine the problem and redefine the question to something that often is harder to answer, is more ungoogleable than the one that I presented to begin with.
Liz, can you put those authors that you just mentioned in the chat box?
Yep.
Then we've got them. Thanks.
Yeah, I was also thinking about the challenge of having students asking non-Googleable questions. And I'm wondering if anyone has done any direct instruction, for instance, in kinds of questions. I had some success with that with my students. Last year, at the beginning of the year, I kind of pre-taught Bloom's taxonomy to them, just so they had a concept of where I was aiming the question. So independent, I transitioned to a flipped classroom, so I was very clear with them that independent reading was aimed at the remember and understand levels, and that was it. And that, I expected them to come to class having read, remembered, and understood what they've read, and if not, to seek me out. And then from there, we are moving through, the analysis and application, moving towards the evaluative model. But once they understand that, different kinds of questions serve different purposes and were meant to elucidate different responses, they seem to ask better questions themselves. And I monitored that through reading journals that I did with students. Which is actually leading me to a next question, which is how do we, one of the problems or the challenges, I guess, with problem or project-based learning is it's gotten this reputation for being this sort of wishy-washy, touchy-feely, hard to assess, nebulous thing that happens where the teachers kick back. And, as I think it was Liz was saying earlier, that, as the students are working, sometimes we're sitting there going, can I help you? Can I help you? What can I do? So I'm wondering, how are those of you who've been using problem or project-based learning, how are you assessing student work? Is there any element of standards-based grading in that? And are you using technology at all to help you with that really complex task?
Well, I've got, I use Evernote. Well, I was just in the first session I was in was an Evernote session. So when they're working and I'm walking around and observing, then I'm typing observations in Evernote. And I think that's, for me, which helps with kind of that nebulous part, is I'm able to capture, specific behaviors, specific skills that they're working on within their work in the project, and then, sharing that out. And most of my feedback is narrative feedback. So what they're getting, what their parents are getting, are narrative feedback, and I'm trying to be specific to, what they're doing during that work time on their project or within a given problem. So I think that's, for me, as far as tech goes, Evernote's been a lifesaver for that, because each kid has a notebook, and then I just throw comments and things into their notebook, which then I can share with parents. I can share the note directly with parents through their email, or I can do it in my narrative feedback on the report card or on the project evaluation. So they get lots of specific comments. So that's what I've been doing.
So Kevin, are these more behaviors that students are engaging in? They're able to collaborate effectively with their peers, or are these actual Common Core, standards and strengths for that?
That's a good question. It's both.
Okay.
So there's behavior ones, but those aren't obviously standards based. Behavior grading, evaluating behavior isn't evaluating the project that they're working on. So they're definitely Common Core, identifying the theme or writing about the theme of a book within the project. And I think it's kind of a mix of both, because I think both of them are important for parents and the students themselves to see what's going on during their project time.
Yeah, it's one of my, I guess, goals for this year is to find a way to integrate Common Core standards at a grade level and the either the ISTE standards, the NETs for students, or I'm not sure if anyone has come across it's ATC 21S, and it's the assessment of 21st century skills. It's a group out of Australia who is actually putting together technology-based, like game-based learning that assesses how students tackle a problem, which I find to be one of the most interesting ways to assess student learning. So I feel like there's a really fruitful opportunity to kind of put together like the soft skills that Common Core talks about, as well as the the numeracy and literacy skills, in addition with the kind of the workplace like professionalism skills. But I'm not sure who's really doing that work right now, other than I guess us.
Yeah.
Well, one of the things is when you're setting up the project at the very beginning level to try to figure out what it is you want kids to be able to do and what you want them to be able to know, and really be clear in your own mind about that. I mean, that is essentially is setting up a standards-based system. I think one of the reasons that people think projects are stupid and squishy and terrible is that we all have experience as students, maybe, and I certainly as parents, of projects that my kids did that had no apparent educational purpose other than to make the pyramid out of sugar cubes, and what the learning goals were there were unclear to kids, unclear to parents, unclear to everybody. And I think you could probably do an interesting sugar cube pyramid project, but you have to be really clear on what your goals are, and probably really clear with the kids on what the goals are. I mean, this is rubrics and project-based learning go nicely hand in hand.
So I have a comment about that. It takes a long time to develop a project, and you really should have a rubric for your project before you launch the project.
Amen.
And so many times I've launched a project before I've finished the rubric, and so that's frustrating for the kids because they feel like I'm changing the project as they're working on it, and they hate that. So if you have the time, it takes a long time to create a project. Really get the rubric done first. Be clear about what you want to achieve.
Have you had the students create rubrics to assess their own learning, or not necessarily as the entire assessment, but as part of the assessment?
I personally have never done that, but I've heard of other teachers doing that. I have the students assess each other for how well they work in groups.
Okay.
And I assess them as well just by observing them. But I think Kevin's idea of using Evernote for that is a great idea.
Yeah.
I'd like to try to get more like narrative comments as I walk around the class while they're working in their groups.
I always have them do for the video a rough cut. So we preview a project that's not quite done and give a whole lot of feedback.
Mm-hmm.
And then they go back, and then they have a few more days to work on it. And then that's the part that I grade, and I do a rubric. I used to do a rubric with points, and the kids would just argue with me about this point and this point and this point. So now I do a rubric with basically with the standard and then my comments next to each thing I'm expecting, and then I just give them a grade because I have to, and it's very subjective in many ways. I try to base it on those comments, and mostly because they have a rough cut and I give them so much feedback about what they need to do to make it better, and if they do all those things, they generally do pretty well anyway. But giving that, I have to give a letter grade, and that's always really challenging.
Oh, the grades. There's a whole nother session topic right there.
Right.
That's been a huge issue for me is having to grade. You know, when I'm really focusing on narrative feedback and the growth mindset, and grading is just the learning killer. I just do not like it. You know, whether it's a 4 or a 5 or a B or whatever, it doesn't matter. It's it's still just a killer. Anyway, I digress.
We just, I'm not sure if it's directed exactly towards us, but an interesting tweet just came through with the edcampHOME hashtag from Jackie Gerstein. And she points out that starting a project for PBL with a rubric is fine, but also need to stay open to emerging learning, which I thought was an interesting point to add to the conversation.
Yeah, that's an interesting point, because if the project takes them somewhere else, or some new learning that they do that isn't on the original rubric, that's a great point.
So I think a way around that is you need to make the rubrics to focus on the deeper learning, and not just how many of these particular things did they do in their project, like a checklist.
Right.
You need to get them to go for critical thinking and deeper learning that could lead in divergent directions.
That's great.
It's also a great place where the design thinking model can be applied, because that really is based on understanding the process much more than the product, so that the ongoing learning can be absorbed into that, and because it's like everything else in the world in 2014, it's an iterative process, but it's a pretty cool approach to project-based learning.
All right. Well, I just saw a couple messages in the chat. We do have to end at 11, so I know we're a couple minutes behind. So we are going to wrap up our discussion. I appreciate all the input today. I will copy the chat box, paste it into a Google Doc, and share that out with you after edcampHOME. It might be later on today, but it was great learning from you, and I appreciate the ideas.
Thank you, Kevin.
All right.
Likewise.
Thank
Thanks
you very
very much,
much.
guys.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.